Okay. Are you guys ready to see a really scary number of tabs? Ooh. Actually, this isn't as bad as it usually is. Okay, so last time we almost but did not quite finish this segment on opioids. And I had a really interesting conversation thereafter with someone who is here right now. So shout out to you, you know who you are, after this, about the difference between heroin and synthetic opioids / other opioids. And that was perfectly timed because now looking at this chart, which is where we left off last time, we can really take a look at how many deaths pertaining to opioids were because of, just ordered some Narcan. Yes, excellent. I'm so glad. Everyone should have Narcan on them. In fact, just a couple of days ago, someone that took DrugSco last semester texted me and was like, I just Narcaned someone last night. Like, everyone should have Narcan. That's excellent. It's really good to know. So this is a really poignant conversation point to lead into for this lecture, because we're looking at this graph right now, and you can see that synthetic opioids, other than methadone, which is an opioid substitution or replacement therapy drug, are by far and away the most common players involved in opioid-related or drug-related overdose deaths, right? Like heroin actually only constitutes about a quarter of these deaths. If you're looking at all synthetic opioids, not methadone, as well as coke, as well as methamphetamine, like if you look at these, you can see that coke is actually pretty close to heroin in terms of overdose-related deaths. So this is something that's super important to keep in mind, because when I was talking with this person after last class, the comment was, I'm feeling a lot of fear about heroin. And I said, well, what about other opioids? What about like oxycodone? And it was kind of like, well, it's medical. It's just a different drug. You know, it seems like heroin's a lot scarier. And because I didn't like have this information on the top of my head, I decided to do a little bit of digging. And last time when I mentioned that chronic prolonged use of heroin can lead to white matter reductions in the brain. White matter is like what causes connectivity between tissue and the brain. And it turns out that that can be generalized across opioids if you use them in a prolonged way, in a prolonged fashion. So as we were talking about it, the main crux of it that I said was basically the reason that heroin is so heavily demonized and stigmatized more so than any other opioid is because, one, people don't often realize that the category of opioids includes the pain relief medications that you get in hospitals. And two, heroin is a very context-based drug. Like when we think about why people die from doing heroin, right? It's usually contaminated drugs, contaminated materials, overdose from doing too much of an existing substance, or it's just a different drug entirely. And when you think about that, and you think about what something like oxycodone, for instance, would look like if it were produced in the same way as heroin is, if it went through the same markets that heroin does, you'd see the same thing. This is an issue of purity. This is an issue of sourcing. So I want you all to really pay attention to this chart right now and see how many other drugs contribute to overdose deaths. And we should be thinking of the class of opioids as opposed to just heroin. And this mentality that like it's heroin that is the big problem negates the fact that it's just another opioid. It really is. Like, is it slightly more potent than other opioids? Sure. Does it have its own individual unique chemical profile that makes it different than other opioids that are more commonly used in medicine? Yes. It has a different risk and reward ratio. For sure, all drugs are different. But I encourage you to not make it its own separate thing, and to think about opioids as a class that includes everything within opioids. So just a note, we'll talk more about that at the roundtable. For those of you that did not see the email about this, next Saturday afternoon, I'm going to be hosting a roundtable discussion. So if there's something that you've been wondering about, a question that you have, a critique, something you want to discuss, or even better, if you really disagree with what I've said so far about anything, bring that to the table. And you can submit it anonymously if you want, using the anonymous feedback form if you don't want me to know that you disagree with me, but I won't be upset. I have to argue with people on Facebook all day as dance safe. Like, it's really bad. Nothing you say could upset me in that way. So again, we're looking at the number of deaths involving opioids, and this number has gone up by 500% as of 2017, since 2002, a 500% increase in deaths involving opioids. But then we also look at the number of prescription opioids sold during 1999 to 2011, which is that approximate time range, and this also quadrupled. So this is kind of an interesting thing that we're seeing here, right? Like there is some correlation between these two things, and correlation does not always equal causation. Just because something is the case doesn't mean that it explains why something else is the case, but it does have a kind of an interesting contributing factor to it. We can explore this a little more, and this is a very light comparison that I'm drawing. You know, this graph is not an exact match, but it is true that there are certain states that have a higher rate of painkiller prescriptions than others do. And when we're looking at overdose deaths, there is some mild correlation between these two things. Now, the fact that a lot of these states don't really have good access to opioid replacement programs and therapies or syringe exchanges or supervised injection. And yes, there are low-key, non-government subsidized supervised consumption sites in the United States. They're just not like overground because they can't be yet. That is also what contributes to overdose. So these are all things to keep in mind when we look at the opioid crisis. And don't call it an epidemic, please. It's a crisis, but it's not an epidemic because of complicated reasons that I won't go into right now, actually, because they're a bit like psychosocial. But we should be looking at a whole bunch of factors when we figure out why certain states have more overdose deaths than others. Are they more rural? Do they have access to healthcare? What is the poverty level? All of these things will play into this. And also, how many prescriptions there are. All of these things are important. So you might be wondering, and I might ask myself, how did I get here? Is this my family? But initially, opioids were just prescribed for cancer patients and post-op people. And then Purdue Pharma hit the market. 1996 to 2001, Purdue Pharma came in guns blazing and was like, nice background, John, wish I was there. Purdue Pharma came in guns blazing and was like, less than 1% of people that use OxyContin get addicted. And the scientific community was like, okay. So there was a huge increase in the number of prescriptions for opioids, like a really massive increase. And interestingly, we see that the number of deaths pertaining to prescription opioids went up pretty much exactly the same as the number of prescriptions, which is what you would expect, you know? But this number just kept climbing. And there are a couple of reasons for it. But again, one of the big ones is that opioids are dependence-forming substances. It's really difficult for some people, especially like soccer moms who have a leg injury, to be adequately informed about the potential for becoming dependent on these substances when they're prescribed to them in the first place. Approximately 1 in 3 homeless deaths are from drug overdose. Approximately. Now, this is a rough estimate because how are we really going to know? People that are housing challenged and housing unstable are among the most marginalized and forgotten members of society. Like, we all know this, right? But I think that a really major misconception about this is that people become homeless because they use drugs. And in some cases, that's the case. But in a lot of cases, people who are already housing challenged or housing insecure end up using drugs because shit sucks. And we'll see this more when we look into global issues with things like inhalants in particular, especially in a lot of countries in like East Asia and Africa. Whiteout, correction fluid, etc., and glue are really popularly used among children who participate in sex trafficking, and not only who are trafficked, but who engage in like child prostitution to get by on the streets. And these drugs are like a way of basically dissociating from what's happening. Now, again, I'm not going to make mad generalizations here because there are a lot of reasons that people would end up being both housing unstable and use drugs and overdose. But again, one of the main reasons is if you're impoverished already, you lose your housing. How are you going to have access to substances that are like clean and safe and reputable? A major cause of death among homeless populations is Hep C because people are sharing syringes. This is a solvable problem. It's very easily solvable. To kind of combat this, one of the things that we've put in place is drug courts. And we'll come back to drug courts a little bit more in depth later, but this is basically an alternative to imprisonment where you have to come in and like talk about your progress with getting clean and it's come before a committee, etc. But even drug courts have a lot of problems with them. And the number one issue that we see in the first place is that law enforcement are targeting people for possession. Something we'll come back to in great depth because, oh my God, do I have a lot to say about this, as you can imagine. But this creates a cycle, and the cycle is the real problem here. The cycle is what makes things impossible to escape from. A lot of homeless folks take drugs to stay awake for safety, particularly women who don't want to be raped, and others so that people don't steal their stuff. Yes, yes. And as I've said in the past, people often misunderstand why people who are impoverished or housing challenged use drugs in the first place, and for many of them, it is a survival technique, actually. Especially for blue-collar workers who are working 3 jobs or who are working extremely strenuous jobs who need to stay awake, methamphetamine is a really effective way to do so. You have to feed your family. I have so many interesting documentaries on this, but The Business of Drugs does a great job of going into that one. So here's an example of what withdrawal might look like if you're undergoing withdrawal in an incarceration or an imprisonment setting. Come down here? Yeah. Think you need to see medical or something? No? Discovery. All right, go ahead and step in here for a quick.
I had a great life. I had a great job, great family. I was engaged when I wasn't using. And then these past 2.5, 3 years, just been the worst. I've lost everything. Everything in my life. These marks here are all old. You see all these little marks right here on my hand. I mean, you can't see any veins in my arms or hands. See, these marks, all these right here, these are all old. All these ones are all new. All the way up here, on this leg, down this leg here, all my whole legs, everything. Those are the new ones. It's pretty bad addiction. I don't even get high anymore. I just do it so I can feel normal. I'm starting to get withdrawals and it's starting to take effect now since I haven't used in almost 12 hours. You start getting cold, hot, start sneezing a lot, nose starts running, vomiting, you can't get comfortable. Imagine being physically sick with the flu, just where you don't want to move. Your bones ache, your body aches, your stomach hurts, you just feel like throwing up, you just drained of everything physically. And that's what I'm going to start going through. I'm scared, to be honest.
This is an experience that many, many people are having right now due to COVID, actually, because of the lack of supply, because the drug market's been disrupted, or at least a lack of ease of access to supply. In fact, there was a recent Vice article that came out that followed a gang in, I think, the UK that had members that were just like spread out across the province, that were by little seaside towns, etc., who are currently basically being like, yo, you have to buy now as fast as possible. The prices are about to go way up, you guys. You have to stock up. And the problem is that when people start going through withdrawals because of the supply, it puts like millions of people out of commission across the globe. Like, it is very debilitating. But imagine having to go through this in this setting, in this cell, where you have like a metal toilet and no privacy and just the clothes that you're wearing. Like, it's inhumane. It's beyond inhumane. And you heard him say himself that this is not something that he even does to get high anymore. It's just to feel normal. Yeah, they can't give him a blanket. Like, yeah. Also, yes, meth does make you horny. It is a libido enhancer. Stimulants in general are libido enhancers, but meth in particular makes you super horny. Also makes it really hard to get it up though. So it's like, or actually doesn't? No, that's MDMA. Meth, you can totally get it up. It's really popular in play sex communities. We've spent like $1 trillion, I think actually close to $2 trillion at this point on the war on drugs, specifically the opioid epidemic or the opioid crisis. That's a lot of money. Okay, I'm just going to say that's a lot of money. If we think about what that money could have been redirected towards, like prevention, and again, I'm not going to get too far into this because it is complicated to know why that's important and why that works. We'll get into the economic supply and demand side of things and why the war on drugs has failed and exactly how it's failed in a little bit. But for now, you should just know that Purdue Pharma was fined for millions of dollars for false advertising of opioids, but it doesn't matter because the ball got rolling in the first place. Meth makes it hard to climax. Yes, exactly. Like a lot of people have kind of erectile dysfunction from different stimulants, but especially like meth is used as a longevity agent because it makes it hard to come. So people can just go at it for like 12 hours, which is wild. But there was this whole legal shit show as people showed up and they were like, yo, we've seen like a 60% increase in Washington state in opioid related hospital stays since Purdue started doing this thing. Like there's a reason for this. Do you know if stimulants generally make most people horny or usually just men? People in general, like some people have higher libido than others, demographically speaking. That's it. But it is a libido enhancer. Now, there are some groups that are trying to organize solutions for this, and one, just as an example, is the Senless Council that's proposed something called Poppy for Medicines, which is basically legalizing opium cultivation because it's currently illegal in a lot of places, but people are doing it anyway because they have no other way to grow crops that will survive and be profitable in this way. And I'll give you a little taste of the supply and demand thing right now. The way that economics work in general for supply and demand markets is that if the price of a good or service goes up, then oftentimes the demand goes down. But drugs are one of the few markets where that's not the case. The price of cocaine could go up to $200 a gram. People will still buy cocaine, especially if people have a psychological dependence of some kind on cocaine. And this means that what we're doing right now with the drug market, with economics, the war on drugs effectively means that it's harder to produce and distribute drugs, which means that a smaller group of people can do so, which means that that group of people ends up having a higher risk, but a huge payout. And because they have that huge payout, they have the money to invest in better technologies and more people and more ammunition. This is the reason that the drug-related or the drug crime-related deaths in Mexico skyrocketed the second the government got involved, the second the government stepped in and started regulating and trying to control the supply. All of a sudden, people were dying, just like civilian casualties went out the ass. Now, we're seeing this with COVID too, right? Whoever just joined, please mute yourself. We're seeing this with COVID too, because right now, drugs in general are at their highest record purity and their lowest record cost. How is that possible when we've spent like almost $2 trillion on the war on drugs? How are drugs more pure and cheaper than ever before? How is that possible? And the reason is that the system we've set up has made it so that moguls can monopolize this industry. They can get super fat off this industry because they control the entire supply chain. That's what we're seeing. So the reason that it's really important to push projects like legalizing cultivating opium is because otherwise one group of people effectively will control the entire system of growing the opium and processing it into different opioids and distributing it through the supply chain. And that's how we end up with cartels. That's how we ended up with cartels. So some ways to reduce risk that we're looking at right now, a major reason that people develop substance issues with opioid prescriptions is that they go doctor shopping and get multiple prescriptions, often because their dose isn't doing enough for them or they're running out too quickly or something like that. Taking higher doses obviously will contribute to this. Having mental illness obviously will contribute to this, but also income level is a huge indicator of this as well. Fentanyl strips are a really important protective measure, and let me tell you, just today, I was looking through recent drug submissions and saw that in Massachusetts, now there's a new batch of cocaine going around that is just fentanyl. Test your powders, like really test your powders. I've tested like 3 different powders in my small town of Oberlin, Ohio, that have tested positive for fentanyl that were cocaine in this town of like 10,000 people, okay? So make sure that you test your powders using fentanyl strips. Some other ways that we're doing this are detox centers. And detox is a different thing than recovery centers, because detox is basically you getting this drug out of your system, going through the process of withdrawal if you are having a substance-related issue with a drug that causes withdrawal, right? And then the other thing is housing, helping people find shelter afterwards. And this is something where you might look at this and be like, yeah, I know, like basics, physiological needs, but don't skip over this one. Because there are a lot of studies right now pointing to the fact that housing insecurity is one of the biggest indicators of problematic substance use. Housing insecurity. This is the main thing right now from what we're looking at from a social perspective that causes people to engage in problematic drug use. I saw a study about this last year, and in the last 10 years, a number of crops, poppy seeds, cannabis, and coca have increased while the war on drugs was going on. Yes, they have. And I'm so excited to get into this unit next, because we're about done with drug spotlights and we're about to move into the more like controversial things, the stuff about politics, the stuff about like social and cultural things. Again, if those are buzzwords that aren't intriguing to you, they should be. And you have a responsibility to get intrigued, because if you know how these drugs work, you need to know how they impact people as well. They go together. When a powder tests positive for fentanyl, is there any safe or safer way to still use it? Have Narcan on hand, have a sober sitter nearby, be prepared to call 911 if someone overdoses. It kind of depends on what powder it is, like what else that powder contains. You should always use at least whatever is available, reagent kit, as well as fentanyl strips. You have to dissolve the powder if you're going to use a fentanyl strip, but you can just let the water evaporate out after a couple of days and then crush it back into powder. The drugs are winning the war on drugs. Yes, they are. And more importantly, the organized crime units are winning the war on drugs by so much and getting so rich while they do it. So currently there are some plans for how to deal with this, right? And a main part of that is expanding treatment to opioid use. And again, all of this stuff, I bet for you, it's really easy to tune out and be like, yes, I know, like, duh, this is a thing that people are doing, like, blah, blah. But this is like way bigger of a deal than you might imagine. Imagine this right now. You're in the middle of a COVID-19 pandemic. You had previously had a prescription for Oxy following a surgery, and you inadvertently became dependent on it, and then it led to a rabbit hole. One thing led to another, and now you're on replacement therapy. You're trying to get yourself out of that situation. In order to do so, you found a methadone clinic nearby that you can go to, where you can go in front of a nurse, they give you a little thing with your pills in it. You take the pills. You're not dope sick that day. You're not high. You can go to work. You can go home and like play soccer with your kids, whatever. Now COVID comes around, and the lines out of the clinic are like hundreds of people long. And you're standing in the hot sun, surrounded by other people, and hoping that no one is symptomatic. You get into the clinic and you have to be there in person, which means that you need multiple hours out of your day to stand in this line and go in person like every day to the methadone clinic to get your dose. What could be happening is people could be sent home with methadone. But those barriers are in place because people don't trust people that use opioids. Now, I understand why that would make people balk and feel uncomfortable, but we have to ask ourselves about the opportunity cost here. And this barrier to access of these treatments is so severe in some cases that people who really could benefit from these treatments can't even access them at all, because there are so many things they have to do to get there in the first place. We're also currently working on getting law enforcement officers Narcan. Can anyone think of a problem with law enforcement officers and Narcan? I'm curious if anyone will hit what I'm getting at here.
Well, if they
drug and therefore convict you of a crime.
Convict you of a crime, okay. Karina, what you're saying?
I was saying that if they incorrectly believe that someone's overdosing on an opioid, then giving them Narcan can be like pretty harmful.
Well, I do have good news in that regard, which is that if you Narcan someone that isn't ODing on an opioid, they'll be fine. It's not going to like hurt them. It's not going to make them uncomfortable. Well, it might make them like a little queasy, but if someone is passed out and their breathing is shallow, Narcan them. Either they're going to come out of it and you'll be like, it's an opioid, or they'll stay down. You'll be like, ooh, not an opioid, something else is wrong. that is a good idea though. Like I do totally see why you would say that. What I'm thinking of here specifically is that law enforcement officers know nothing about drugs. In fact, law enforcement officers frequently make claims that they like ran into someone. In fact, just in my town, I'll tell you the story in my town. There's a Walmart nearby. Ooh, sorry if anyone's like a Walmart fan. I'm just waiting for someone to turn on their video and their whole room has like Walmart flags and they're wearing like a Walmart baseball cap. So at this Walmart nearby, there was a 911 call because someone was acting erratically in the store, apparently. Now, the word that got out was that an officer approached this person, and then there were like airborne fentanyl particles from this person somehow, in some unexplained way, that got onto the officer's skin. And then the officer Narcaned herself while she was conscious. And then they closed down the Walmart and took the guy to our local terrible hospital where multiple people fell ill within range of him. And then it was closed off as a hazmat situation, and there were news choppers. And the release that was made, the report that was made, that people just like immediately locked onto was this guy was covered in fentanyl or something, blah, blah, fentanyl. And our officer like got fentanyl on her skin and started like getting sick or ODing or something like that. And then like other people got fentanyl on their skin or something. I like, it's so crossed. And I looked at that and was like, okay, let's see how this unfolds. So a week or a half or so later, the extremely well-educated president of our local terrible hospital system was like, okay, we did a toxicology report on this guy. No fentanyl was found, but like, we're sure that it was fentanyl. And you read that in the direct translation, for those of you that don't read uninformed public health official, is blah, 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 blah. I have no idea what drugs do, blah, 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 blah. Fentanyl cannot be absorbed through your skin. In case you've heard of this, fentanyl cannot be absorbed through your skin. If it is, it would have to be like a pile of it sitting there for like a couple minutes or like an hour or something for it to ever absorb. Your skin is really good at keeping stuff out. If you're going to get high off of fentanyl, you'd have to touch it to a mucous membrane. And even so, the likelihood of doing so is so low, right? So if a cop says, I got doused with fentanyl and like someone dropped a bag of fentanyl on me and I like OD'd and had to save myself, bitch, if you're ODing, you're not going to Narcan yourself, okay? I'm just going to say that. So keep an eye on news reports that say stuff like that, because that just is the most baffling. Yeah, this person knows which hospital I'm talking about. Yeah, there are actually two people here that go to my college, and both of them know my story. So that's just something to keep in mind, that law enforcement officers don't actually know shit about drugs. And while Narcanning someone is not going to hurt them, it really is reflective of a system that is like being funded in the wrong direction. So some harm reduction stuff for opioids. You have to test them before you use them. Holy shit. To put it in perspective, in Chicago right now, it is so standard practice for heroin to not be heroin that I'm asked to like not release reports on like a sample of dope where you send it into the lab for testing, and it's like quinine and xylazine and diphenhydramine and fentanyl and 4-ACPP and stuff like that. And they're like, oh yeah, that's normal. When I asked the lab folks, they're like, don't release a report on it. Everyone here knows that that's heroin now. That's just how it is in a lot of the country. Like fentanyl is in like so much of the heroin supply. You have no idea. So the real risk of this is if you don't do a fentanyl strip test on your dope first, there's this thing called the chocolate chip cookie effect, which means that only a couple of grains of fentanyl could be scattered throughout a bag. So if you test only a sample of your bag and not the whole thing, you could very easily do a shot that has all of the fentanyl in it. So important to test your opioids. Like, I cannot state that enough. Always use clean needles, period. Like, period. You need to use clean needles if you are someone that injects a drug. If you rapidly increase your dose, obviously you're putting yourself at risk for overdose. That's a standard practice, I would say. having Narcan on hand, just as a layperson. I have it in my Camelback wherever I go. Like, you never know when you're going to need to use it, genuinely. You could genuinely save a random person's life at some point. I think that's a great thing to keep in mind when you're packing your bag to go out for a picnic. Like, what if? There's no harm in doing so. You can get it in a local pharmacy. And most of the time you can find a place to get Narcan for free. There's no reason to not have it and know how to use it. It's so easy to use. Mixing depressants with opioids is a deadly combination. It will stop your heart. Please stay away from benzos and alcohol and DXM if you are planning on doing opioids. And remember that if you're using in a new environment, lower your normal dose. All right? If anyone has questions, you have T-minus 5 seconds to ask them before we talk about the weed. Anything on Quaaludes? We'll come back to Quaaludes. Interestingly, Quaaludes are making a comeback for the first time in like 40 years. We're seeing actual pill testing reports on Quaaludes that actually contain the active component methaqualone, which is crazy. They've been vanished for like 4 decades. Let's talk about weed. But first, what are some terms for preparing and administering opioids in terms of injection? What are some phrases, some things that you do maybe with them? Any part of the process. Cook them. Anyone remember how you cook them?
You're asking for like the whole process?
Any part of the process. Lighter under a spoon, I see. And you mix it with
Well, if they're you crush it up.
Okay.
You add some water.
Mm-hmm.
You put a lighter underneath the spoon.
Mm-hmm.
Then I think a cotton ball.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
You stick the syringe in the cotton ball after it's sucked up everything.
Mm-hmm.
And I think there's also like some people trade or use the cotton ball excess. But anyway, yeah.
Yes. Excellent. That was a great description. So those terms are called cooking, and then in the process of actually shooting up, you draw it up into the syringe, you squirt a little bit out the top so there's no air bubbles, because if there's an air bubble at the top of your needle, you're just going to inject oxygen into your brain, which could stop your heart. And then in the process of preparing to inject, you have to produce the vein. I have a massive, very infected bug bite right where I was about to slap and show you guys. I'm not going to do that. It's like really big. I don't really know what's wrong. And then from there, you can inject it. Now, this is not always into a vein, right? And we'll look back at those terms. Blowing a shot is when you miss your vein. What are some physical effects of opioids? Physical effects. How do they make you feel? What do they make your body do? Nod off. Yeah. What's the main thing that they're used for?
Pain relief.
Exactly. Anyone remember the official name for that? Relax, yeah. Analgesia. High five, Jay. Exactly. Anyone know what happens in your abdomen under the influence of opioids? This is a huge, very significant side effect. Constipation. Yep, it slows down the muscle contractions in your intestines, the peristalsis. It's always happening. Your body's like a worm, you know what I mean? And also meiosis and pruritus. These are the 2 other major ones. Your pupils constrict under the influence of opioids. Dope sickness can happen during withdrawal, and you can also nod off or out, which is going in and out of consciousness and sedation. What is the biggest danger of overdosing on an opioid? Come on, y'all. This is an important one to know. Heart stops. Okay. Why would your heart stop? Depressed respiration. Blood pressure drops. Yes, all of these things in conjunction. lack of oxygen. Your blood pressure drops, you're not circulating oxygen through your body as effectively, your respiration drops, so you're not getting as much oxygen, and the two of those things can cause you to go into cardiac arrest. And someone says, this is a really good point, I'd like to point out in the name of harm reduction that a micron filter is so much better for filtering than a cotton ball. Yes, this is a really great thing to point out. Thank you so much for saying this, Ember. That's awesome. Where is the majority of fentanyl being made right now? China, that's right. But also, I do need to point something out with this. The fact that so many synthetic drugs are being produced and trafficked in countries like China and Mexico means that they are wildly subject to xenophobia. Be careful with how you conceptualize these things. Just because a country is the predominant producer of a certain drug does not mean that you can attribute some kind of inherent evil to the people that live within that country. Be very careful about how you think about these things. This is a huge reason that we have Trump's America right now, is because it's really easy for people to be like, well, Mexico's importing drugs, so Mexicans are bad, and China's importing drugs, so the Chinese are bad. Or most recently, coronavirus may have originated in China, so China's gross. Don't be that bitch. Okay, seriously, just because a drug originates from a place does not mean that that place is inherently evil. And that is a really easy rabbit hole to go into. But it's important to know for trade route purposes. The motherland. They only make it because America buys it. Exactly. America and Europe are the two places that want these drugs. So other countries make them because they have easier limitations on import and production. Like, that's it. If we didn't have the demand, they wouldn't make the supply. Another market would arise. They're just not as profitable, period. And because they have an awesome chemical industry, exactly. In fact, when US drug manufacturers need advice, they go to China and they're like, what are you guys doing? Because you guys are fucking killing it in this industry. So yeah, think about that one. What form of heroin is the hardest on veins?
Black tar.
That's right, black tar heroin. What are these called? Starts with a T. It's two words. First word starts with a T. Track marks. Nice. Ember, you're killing it. Yeah, track marks. This is indicators of injection sites, and they can be anywhere. They're little, basically like tiny bruises. What is this? What is this person doing? What is the term for it? Chasing the dragon. Exactly. Chasing the dragon is smoking powder or pills by putting them on tin foil and lighting them from underneath and tilting it a little bit, and then there will be like a line as the thing slides down and you can inhale the vapor as it goes. What are these called? What is this route of administration called?
Skin popping?
Exactly, that's right, skin popping. Does anyone know which drug skin popping is really popular with? Give you a hint, it's a stimulant.
Cocaine.
Exactly. Skin popping is really popular with cocaine. Does anyone remember why someone might skin pop instead of injecting? Or like injecting intravenously?
Slower onset?
Nice, nice, good memory. Slower onset, so it's a little bit less likely to overdose, but also it's just easier to do if you don't have veins readily available. And also people are often really freaked out by the prospect of IVing and getting it wrong. Okay, now for something completely different, let's look at the nug. So cannabinoids are the active components of cannabis, right? So the two main, most well-known cannabinoids are THC and CBD, right? Which is I tried to pronounce it, I give up. I was so confident going into that. I was like, it's gonna be so fast. and then cannabidiol, right? But there are also a ton of other cannabinoids contained within weed, like CBN and CBG, and 113 or more. Additionally to those few cannabinoids, like weed is a complex, dense motherfucker. It's got a lot going on inside of it, right? Now, in your brain, in case you weren't already aware of this, your brain makes its own weed, low-key, but not exactly. Obviously, weed's more complicated, but your brain has its own endocannabinoid system. Remember that endo means inside of. So this is a system that makes endogenously produced cannabinoids, two of which, and this is not really that important, you don't really have to know this, but AEA and 2AG. And these endocannabinoids that are already functioning inside of your body are responsible for your feeding behavior and having pleasure from exercising and motivation and reward. And we'll see exactly how this system exerts its effects. Damn it, I'm hungry. Well, runner's high is actually from the opioid system. Endogenous opioids like endorphins are what cause the runner's high. So this is like a complementary system. A runner's high is a very specific kind of feeling that's very kind of soft and physical. This is more like a cognitive thing. So the two main receptors, because again, your brain is just ready to accept weed, which is super funny, but you could also say that your brain is ready to accept acid. So I don't know why I'm saying this. I just think that it's funny. But there are two main kinds of cannabinoid receptors in the brain and body. The first is CB1 receptor, which is mainly in your brain, but is in other places too. And the CB1 receptor is basically responsible for influencing other neurotransmitters. And this is a really complicated kind of sciencey thing we're about to talk about. I'm going to try my best to make it palatable, but stop me at any time because it is complicated. And then there's CB2, which are receptors that are mainly in your immune system. So we have the CB1 receptor, mostly in your brain, that deals with your neurotransmitters. And then you have CB2, which is mostly in your immune system and deals with inflammation, as well as other things, and controlling your gut bacteria, making sure your body doesn't eat too much of its good gut bacteria. Now, the main job of cannabinoid receptors, the main job of this weed system in the brain is balance, reaching homeostasis, making things feel okay, making things feel more neutral than they would otherwise. This is a regulatory system. It goes in and it basically is like, look, here's my feedback on what you could be doing differently so that this person is more balanced right now. That's what it's doing all the time, 24/7. So in the case of your CB1 receptors, which are primarily dealing with neurotransmitters, their job is to inhibit other neurotransmitters and be like, nah, you should like chill out on whatever it is you're doing. And this is often seen in GABA and glutamate. So depending on what the situation is, GABA and glutamate will be inhibited by the endocannabinoid system that's kind of like watching and looking and being like, do we need all of you right now, or should we like tone it down over there? Really makes you wonder what made it advantageous for cannabis to select for having things as complicated as cannabinoids that just happen to hit these receptors in the brain. Well, I do think that it is a funny thing that we have a system that, like in our brains in general, where you can introduce a chemical and our brain will be like, okay, like let's enhance what we're already doing, because that's every single drug is going in and being like, whatever's happening here, let's make more. And the same can be said for all your other systems. It's really wild, right? Like with opioids, technically you could be saying like your brain has built-in heroin to a tiny, tiny degree. It does its own thing on a much smaller scale. Drugs just enhance it. And then CB2 receptors are going to decrease inflammation and again, prevent your gut from eating its own good bacteria. Oh God, are you guys ready for some complex shit? Or it's actually not that complicated, but I made it like a little bit too metaphorical maybe, so bear with me. So let's take a look at glutamate, right? We have this glutamate, or this neuron that has primarily glutamate neurotransmitters in it, right? So down here at the bottom, we have signaling that's happening right now. We have cannabinoids that are getting released and they go backwards. This is the interesting part about the cannabinoid system, is that usually, right, you have all these neurotransmitters right here. They get released, they bind at the receptor, something happens, and then they get sucked back in. But with cannabinoids, it's different. Your endocannabinoids actually live on the surface of the postsynaptic neuron. And when they notice that something is not quite right, they fly back up and they reduce what's happening above them. So for instance, in the case of glutamate, if your brain is like, oh man, like I'm feeling kind of anxious right now. Like there's a lot happening here. I'm releasing a lot of glutamate and my system is like very active right now. Your endocannabinoid system and these eggs down here might be like, we should do something about this. And they send up a message and they're like, yo, we should tone it down. We should reduce how much glutamate's happening right now. And they'll be like, oh yeah, totally. Okay, for sure. But the same thing is true, interestingly, for GABA, right? Any neurotransmitter any neuron that has endocannabinoids on the postsynaptic cleft is going to be able to go up and be like, yo, you should stop whatever it is you're doing. You should do less of it. So this is something that's going to possibly increase your awareness and your fight or flight, because if you're reducing the activity of GABA, then your system will be less suppressed. So that's kind of funny, right? Like you have two ways of doing this kind of opposite dance. Like usually if you increase the effects of glutamate, your system's more connected. If you increase the effects of GABA, your system is slower. So if you decrease both, they'll just do the opposite thing that they normally would. And this can be advantageous for a couple of reasons. And one of them is that glutamate indirectly influences dopamine. So endocannabinoids aren't usually going to act directly on dopamine themselves, but if they're influencing glutamate, then dopamine will be affected by it. So that's the reason that it's not just impacting GABA, because this whole thing has like a systemic effect. It's like a ripple effect to try and keep your body more in balance. How complicated is this so far? Are we completely lost? I'm going to clarify more in a minute. Wait, did you say cannabinoids cause more GABA or less GABA? Endocannabinoids are inhibitory. So whatever neurotransmitter they're looking at through their binoculars, they're going to reduce its effects if they think there's too much of it happening. Does that make sense? So let's say you have lookout birds on a neuron that is producing GABA, and they're like, there's a lot of GABA happening right now. Like, I think the system is too slow, and maybe we should be more active or more creative. They'll be like, hey, can you tone it down up there with the GABA? We're trying to, like, draw stuff while we're baked and eat a lot. Yes, thanks. You're welcome, thanks. Okay, so let's look at this from a science-y perspective. And I'm so sorry, this is a really terrifyingly analytical video that has a lot of science-y terms that are probably going to be really intimidating. Don't worry about it. Spoiler alert, we're gonna see Putin's head. That sounds like the ocean.
Within the brain, CB1 receptors are among the most abundant G-protein coupled receptors.
Ignore that.
However, in contrast to classical signaling, where information travels from pre to postsynaptic neurons,
we know what that
the
means.
ECS uses retrograde signaling. The information travels from post to presynaptic neurons.
Right, so usually we have a neurotransmitter gets released from the top, it floats out, it binds at the bottom, and something happens. But with cannabinoids, it's backwards. Instead of top to bottom and something happens, they go back up and kind of report back from the ground. They're like, this is what I see, Captain.
Let's take a closer look at this mechanism using a glutamatergic neuron model. When an action potential reaches the axon terminal,
that just means what all this is about to say is when electricity strikes and pops the neurotransmitter bubbles, as we enthusiastically say in Drugs Go,
brain depolarization triggers the release of glutamate.
Glutamate's released.
Glutamate binds to postsynaptic glutamate receptor.
We know what that means, right? Glutamate comes out, it binds to a receptor and something happens, facilitates memory and learning, etc.
Inducing calcium channels to open.
Ignore that.
During periods of intense neural activity, calcium accumulates in the postsynaptic neuron.
Sorry.
This calcium buildup causes the synthesis and release of endocannabinoids from membrane lipids.
So basically, a lot's happening in your glutamate system right now. There's a lot of activity going on, and excess glutamate could lead to anxiety, right? Like that makes sense. Anxiety, heightened sensitivity to body awareness. So when that's happening, something happens right here in science terms that we're not going to talk about, that basically wakes up the endocannabinoids, and they're like, oh, Captain, my Captain, this seems as though we're headed for anxiety o'clock right now. So they get released back out to be like, yeah. Like
diffusing
this.
Across the synaptic cleft, the endocannabinoids bind to the CB1 receptor, activating the G protein. Activation influences ion flow. The result, suppression of presynaptic neurotransmitter release. Endocannabinoids are subsequently taken back into the cell and enzymatically degraded.
Okay, so I know a lot of that probably sounded like total gibberish, but I hope we got the gist, right? Usually, like glutamate would get released into the synapse, it binds on the other side and makes something happen. But if that's happening too much, the endocannabinoids are woken from their beautiful slumber, and then they go out and they're like, okay, guys, we gotta chill out right now. So this is how it helps your system reach balance. They're kind of alerted when too much of something is happening, so they can kind of come in and be like, all right, the party's over. So to illustrate this, I've included Putin and a foot because I think that that is the best way to learn about anything. So endocannabinoids are kind of buried in the skin of the postsynaptic neuron. They're just like sitting there waiting in their little bird nest. And then when certain events happen that indicate that there's too much activity happening with a particular neurotransmitter, they're like, oh shit, something's going on right now. They fly up to the prior neurotransmitter, or the prior neuron, sorry, and they're like, look guys, I know this, you're having such a good time and I'm really happy for you about it, but you need to turn the music off, it's too loud up there. And they're like, oh god, I'm so sorry about that. And then they stop being quite as active as they were before, and then the signaling gets reduced a little bit. So this is how you regulate the system. And the same thing, like I said, is the case with GABA, right? If there's a lot of GABA and your system's really slow and sluggish, then something like THC might come in and be like, come on guys, like you should stop releasing as much GABA because we're trying to be active right now. We're trying to be like motivated to do things. This is called retroactive signaling. It goes backwards, right? Like the DeLorean. Now, because researchers were noticing, which time do we have? Because researchers were noticing that the CB1 receptors were involved in feeding behavior, because a lot of your neurotransmitters give you pleasure and motivation to eat food, right? Researchers were like, we could exploit this. We could make a drug that would alleviate obesity by preventing these receptors from being as active. So they made rimonabant, and that's not really going to work. So they tried blocking the CB1 receptor so you couldn't get that feeling and have that homeostasis. And the study had to be cut off prematurely because 4 people committed suicide and there were a shitload of major psychiatric side effects. So this really goes to show you how essential it is to have this regulatory system in place, right? Like this is the system that basically does checks and balances on your brain. So here's the big idea behind endocannabinoids and cannabinoid receptors. That study, I believe, 2016? I'm not positive. I do not remember. So cannabinoids go backwards, right? Like they're not like normal neurotransmitters. They go up to the presynaptic neuron instead of down to the postsynaptic neuron. And this system is basically going in and controlling and giving feedback to other neurotransmitters. Its job is to be the watchdog, the lookout, the one that's like, there's too much of this thing happening, you should stop. And that can have widespread effects throughout the system. What the heck? How are they not monitoring subjects? Yeah, I don't know. I don't know, man. I don't know. So let's go into more specifics about the weed, all right? For those of you that are already stoners, congratulations. You're going to know a lot of this stuff, and that's really impressive for those of you that live in California in particular. So THCA and CBDA are the inactive compounds contained in the plant itself. And when you burn them, they break off little pieces in a poof of smoke, as beautifully demonstrated here, and then you're left with CBD and THC. This is why you can't just eat weed straight, which I'm not positive why you would want to do, because that sounds a lot like eating peanut butter when you have cotton mouth, because holy shit, it's sticky plant matter. But this is the reason that you need to actually bake it or burn it. This is decarboxylation. That's what that means. It's like breaking off something. So the TLDR effects of THC, it's the chemical that gets you high. CBD does not get you high. THC is the psychoactive chemical, and this means that it's going to have impact on dopamine and norepinephrine. Now, this is part of the reason that more THC-heavy strains are more likely to cause anxiety and paranoia than more CBD-heavy strains, because since THC influences both dopamine and norepinephrine, it has the potential to really amp up the system in ways that CBD will not as much. In fact, CBD is an anxiolytic. However, THC is an anxiogenic. THC can actually cause anxiety. So when people have major panic attacks from smoking weed for the first time, a lot of the time it's because they have a really THC-heavy things. Not sure if I'm skipping ahead, but what are the dangers of using pesticides when growing cannabis? We will come back to that when we talk about the environmental impacts of growing cannabis in a couple of lectures. So your appreciation for sensory information goes up. Why might that be? Anyone have a theory on why your appreciation for sensory things might go up if you're under the influence of THC, given what we know about neurotransmitters? GABA suppression. So yes, you're a little bit more active. Specifically in this case, it's more related to dopamine, because dopamine is more of a reward kind of situation. So in terms of the legality of THC, the World Health Organization initially classified it as Schedule 1, big bad substance, fuck this thing. And then they were like, that seems like it might be a little harsh. So they were like, let's make it Schedule 2 instead. And then shortly thereafter, they're like, maybe it should be Schedule 3. And then they were like, I don't know, maybe I think maybe it should be Schedule 4, which is, I think, maybe their lowest scheduling denomination. Meanwhile, the United States is sitting over here eating glue, and they've scheduled THC as Schedule 1, which is really interesting because shortly thereafter, we released an FDA-approved synthetic THC medication, which I find fascinating because does anyone remember what the Schedule 1 designation means?
No medical use.
No accepted medical value. So the United States makes THC Schedule 1 and then releases synthetic THC as a medication. Oh, I'm not sure about this one, folks. To be fair, heroin is also like a prescribable opioid that is Schedule 1. Like, our scheduling system is not very, no medical value. Exactly, yes. And then on the other hand, this is the last thing we'll go over today. There's CBD, which is sleepy relax time. It's not psychoactive. It can be a muscle relaxant. It can induce kind of like a light sedation and sleepiness. But these two balance each other out. That's why they work so synergistically together, is that the CBD provides kind of a relaxing effect and the THC provides more of a stimulating effect. And because we're all about homeostasis here, those two work really nicely together to provide that within the system. Now, I kind of fucked up that it was ever Schedule 1 for the UN because weed does have a cultural relevance for some versions of Hinduism, especially Shiva worship. Oh yeah. And it also has been utilized in like Chinese culture and medicine since I think 1800 BC or something like that, where we found someone who was buried with his like bag of weed recently from 1800 BC. Yeah. When too high, a little CBD can really help bring back that balance. Yes, exactly. That's a really good point. THC and CBD both have a slew of, yes, medical values, but CBD in particular has just this massive list of ailments that it can effectively treat and participate in the alleviation of. And this is further exemplified on this chart, which we're not going to look like super intensely. I know this because I was in India during Shivratri. I don't want to mispronounce that, Shivratri. And literally everyone was high in the streets. Yes. Yeah. And we're going to come back to India and weed when we talk about a little bit more of the culture surrounding it. Last thing that I'll say for today is that, so politicians were like, okay, everyone is terrified of weed, so we're going to make CBD its own thing, because previously it wasn't even like individually scheduled, just weed was scheduled and THC was scheduled, but until a couple years ago, CBD was not actually scheduled as its own separate thing because it's not fucking psychoactive. So politicians in 2016 were like, all right, let's just like go out of our way to make this a Schedule 1 drug because we are dicks. Also, 2 years later, by the way, we just approved this new anti-epilepsy drug, Epidiolex, that is CBD. We hope you're as excited about this as we are. Coming up next time on Drugs Go, we are going to go further into this CBD scheduling scandal and look at the fact that the United States actually has a patent on the neuroprotective effects of cannabinoids dating back to the early 2000s, interestingly enough. That's it for this week. I will see you guys on Tuesday. Thanks for tuning in and have a fantastic night.